Mrs. Stanton, what a treat it is to see you. And Mr. Douglass.
It is indeed a pleasure to be with two of my favorite suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. It's what a pleasure it is today.
I've always been a great admirer of yours, Mr. Douglass, ever since you started visiting our family home in Rochester. And I had the opportunity of getting to know you along with other members of my family. We knew that you were someone with great powers to donate to good causes.
Well, you know, I came to Rochester and met you two ladies. It was much by almost an issue that not my intent to come to Rochester to get involved in the suffrage movement. My first intentions were to leave Lynn, Massachusetts, bring my family to Rochester to get a good education for my children, which I found out was a little bit more difficult than I thought. But then I get there and I meet both of you, and my whole direction changed trajectory. Yes.
Well, if you'll recall, Mr. Douglass, we met when we were both still in Massachusetts. And
yes.
I likewise moved to New York, and it was not my intention to become a part of the suffrage movement. When we came to Seneca Falls, it was for my husband's health and for his political career as well. And it was only after I'd been in Seneca Falls for a year and realized that some of the grandeur and glory of housekeeping having worn off, I needed to occupy my time in some meaningful work.
Well, surely that started when you and Mrs. Mott attended the International Anti-Slavery Convention in London, and the women were not permitted to be seated with the delegates, even though you were duly chosen delegates of the American chapter.
Well, certainly, but it took me 8 years. I had 3 children between London in 1840 and Seneca Falls, the first convention in 1848. And as you'll recall, Susan, there were several more following those 3 miserable little underdeveloped vandals that you helped me take care of all those years.
Well, you did have unusual views about child rearing, I must say. You know, when I used to go and help out at your home, I just didn't know what to do with them sometimes. I think they feared me, but I was a much sterner caregiver than you were.
You know, those boys were absolutely certain that you had the ability to look around corners.
Oh, would that I could.
Well, as most men in that time, the predominance of men, I had the advantage of having my wife, Anna Murray, to take care of my children. And so I had a little bit more freedom from the home to be traveling and speaking and those sorts of things. But I certainly admired everything you all were doing.
Well, I certainly was never willing to give up my life of freedom in order to become some man's housekeeper. And the freedom that I maintained was very important to the partnership that I developed with Mrs. Stanton. Isn't that right, dear?
I believe so. I believe you were married to the cause.
I think I was. And all of the young women in the cause called me Aunt Susan, and as well as my sister's children, who were like children to me.
Now, I likewise was, in a very calculated way, I was putting on a show of a motherly and then a grandmotherly persona with my clothing, but I did love my children. I had those 7 children, but I always felt it was my responsibility, if I ever saw a child in distress, to do something about it. And as much as suffrage was about my rights as a citizen, it was also about the rights of all of those dear girls out there. Some of them were little infants in their cradles, but I knew that one day they needed to have protection and liberty that only the rule of law can give them.
Well, of course, we realized early on when we wanted to change the property rights to married women and to try to support the cause of temperance so that we would no longer hear hideous stories of men coming home and beating their wives when they had consumed all the contents of their wage packet on the way home, and the wife would say there was no food to take care of the children. We knew that all of those women and all of those children, whether we knew them personally or not, were in great distress. And in trying to change the laws to ameliorate that situation, it rapidly became clear that it could be only done through the ballot box, which we, of course, were denied.
No, I think it's important for people to remember, and so few perhaps do, how many gentlemen were from the very beginning of our movement in favor of equality for women, because they understood, as Mr. Douglass did, that if we are to have universal equality, it must be inclusive of all of us, and that no one's liberty is safe until everyone's liberty is guaranteed.
Well, absolutely. One of the things that I was so enamored about was the skills and the intellect that you all had. Mrs. Stanton, you just had a great legal mind. You were a superior writer, and you produced so much content for not just for yourself and your thinking, but for others. You wrote speeches for other people as well. And so for that type of talent and intellect to go to waste is a crime in itself. And so when I started working with you all, it was, especially with you, Susan, I really had to get over the fact that I came out of Ireland and England a little bruised. Bruised from the fact that I got away from my cause of abolition of slavery and got out into the fray of other kinds of ideas and movements, talking about the Protestants and the Catholics, and I got in a lot of trouble over there. So I came back to America really intent on being a one-cause man. But in meeting you all convinced me that suffrage was an idea that I could include in my umbrella and form a coalition with you all.
Well, certainly if we are citizens required to obey the laws of the land, yet have no voice in creating those laws, then it very much negates what Mr. Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, that if you find the government not supportive of the ends of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is up to the people to overthrow such governments and put another government where our needs would be better met. Well, a disenfranchised class could certainly have no say in that and could do nothing, no matter how unsuitable a government might be towards our happiness.
Well, there were so many fronts on which people were disenfranchised. It's a wonder that we even came to a central idea with all the other things like temperance and such, that we could have really had an umbrella that was so broad that we weren't specific about anything.
When we began our journey in Seneca Falls and we listed our grievances, we didn't list them with any kind of caution. We were quite brave. We were very bold in discussing things that women needed. We needed representation and the vote. We also talked about the need to have custody of our children. We needed to have possession of our own wages, our own property, representation in the courts and the colleges. But that voting, that idea of voting was still very radical, and so many friends, Quakers, and other Garrisonians were aghast that I introduced it. And it was, I think, because in so many ways, they wondered if it was ethical for people to vote in a system they considered immoral and coercive. It was a system that excluded, that threatened violence against those who disagreed with it. Were we to become involved in an unethical system by using our vote, would we become less moral beings if we did not use moral suasion as Garrison and Lucretia Mott would have it? And I think, Mr. Douglass, that you and I began to see that there were some limitations in that moral perfectionism.
Well, absolutely. I think that's where we had our strongest bond, is that we initially came into the movement under the influence, so to speak, of some great people, you, Mrs. Mott, and myself, Mr. Garrison. But eventually, as I started becoming more confident as a writer, as an orator, I decided that it was time for me to step out on my own and to have my own newspaper. And so I think these are the things that the gravity, so to speak, that brought us all together.
No, cautious, careful people who are more concerned about their reputation never could bring about change. So I do admire the courage with which you stepped forward. The temperance movement was a good whole training experience for me, as far as organizing and learning to speak in public. Of course, only with the Daughters of Temperance, it was just unheard of when we started our struggle, Mrs. Stanton, for a woman to speak in public in a group that was mixed of women and men. But I learned there, and Mr. Garrison did respect my abilities when he asked me to be the New York State agent of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And we did allow the abolitionist movement to take the forefront, don't you think? Before and during the war, we needed to wipe out that hideous stain on this nation. But after that, of course, I had only one goal, and it was universal suffrage, equal rights for all.
The movement certainly changed when you decided to join us. I think of all of those thoughts and ideas that ran around in my head, the evenings I spent at my fireside with my children thinking great thoughts, but you were the one who hurled those thunderbolts into the universe for me. I think that, you know, I could not have done all the work I did had it not been for what you brought to me, the information, the enthusiasm, the grit that you gave to me, as well as your dear, dear friendship.
Well, that was indeed the core of our partnership. We complemented each other beautifully and came up with arguments that have been unanswered to this very day. I remember your husband putting it quite sweetly when he saw me working in the kitchen with the baby on my hip. He said, "Oh, I see. Susan stirs the pudding so Elizabeth can write the words. So Susan can go out and stir up the nation."
That's right. You know, in writing, we did better work together than either of us could have done alone. While you were slow and analytical, I was rapid and synthetic. I was the better writer, but you were the better critic. And you supplied the facts and statistics, and I supplied the philosophy and the rhetoric, and together we made arguments that have withstood unshaken the storms of all the years.
Yes. Truly, I could not have done any of this on my own. People ask me if I'm the leader of this movement. And I reply, well, I certainly help to organize the work that we do. I certainly hope to inspire people, both men and women, as to the justice of our cause. But I don't think of myself as a leader. Growing up in a Quaker household, I would never have thought to put myself above other people, but we were an army, if you will, of people working together for a just cause.
Well, all of us, I believe, were voted by the people to be leaders of this or that. One of the reasons, I guess, they sent me the invitation to run alongside the first woman running for president. They elected me a leader. They wanted to elect me a leader. But I said, I'm not a politician. I'm an abolitionist. And so, in other words, I'm in the abolition of slavery, you're trying to influence the powers that be to change course. And I think that's what, in the eyes of the public and those people who might not have been able to contribute more to the cause, they said, well, let Miss Anthony lead us. Let Mrs. Stanton lead us. Let Frederick Douglass lead us.
So I did run for Congress in the first election after the Civil War, received 24 votes. But I was the first woman to run for Congress. And I didn't think I would win, but we have to try every strategy that we think might give us success. Certainly the vote may not have been a panacea, but it certainly was one of the weapons in our arsenal. And in so many ways, this was a great battle, and we were an army. But the thing to remember is an army marches on its stomach, and we all know from our own positions that both the suffragist movement and the movement for the rights of free people in the North were often underfunded. And we had everything we could do just to get enough money to go out and give our speeches, publish our works.
Yes, that's when we, I don't know if it was reluctantly or eagerly accepted money from Mr. George Francis Train in order for us to publish our newspaper. Oh, that raised quite a fuss in the movement. He was an outspoken opponent of suffrage for the free Negroes. And I always felt that if the women got the vote, they would be sure to bring their Black brothers and sisters into the suffrage with them. I was not so sure that that would happen if the Negro men got the vote first, and I'm afraid I was correct in that. Yes, I think in a movement as large as this one, we can't help but perhaps make some decisions that we would later regret.
Well, I think and I was just thinking, I was listening to both of you speak, and a question came to mind, surely I would probably defer to one of the other of you, probably you, Susan, that what is more important, our activism or the vote? I mean, we spent most of our lives without the ability to vote. And then after or the Black man got that right to vote, the vote becomes this thing that we look forward to. But which is more important, our activism or the opportunity for us to step into the ballot box? Which would you say is more important?
Oh, I think they must both march together in equal step. We never gave up our other forms of activism in petitioning state legislatures to amend or withdraw their laws about property rights for married women. That did not necessarily require the vote. We continued to speak about temperance. We continued to speak about wages, unequal wages, and unequal educational opportunities for girls and women. So that all continued right alongside our calls for the vote, because we were not sure that we would ever be able to achieve any of those goals without access to the ballot box.
So I think at this point in our lives, Susan, you and I began to diverge in some of our strategies. I began to say that we needed to talk about religion more specifically, and you said that if we had the vote, all of religious prejudice and other problems that we had would disappear like dew in the morning. And I said that I was tired of singing like Poe's Raven suffrage evermore. I became very much more concerned with the issue that I saw in the latter part of our century, when I saw that many women who had entered into the fold of suffrage wanted to use the vote to denigrate others, to take away some of our freedoms. I was particularly concerned with Frances Willard and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And I do recall you cautioning me, concerned that I would alienate the more conservative suffragists, and I was concerned that you would alienate the freethinkers. We did not always see eye to eye, but we tried to present a united front. The three of us, even though we had difficulties in our relationships in public, we could not always agree. In private, we could not always see eye to eye, and we were often alarmed by each other's behavior and positions, but somehow we managed to maintain this close, remarkable friendship?
Well, I certainly saw some of the privileges that you all had in comparison to, say, for example, Black women. There were many Black women in the movement as well, of course. Sojourner Truth, Frances E.W. Harper, all of these women had opportunities and the skills to step out and speak on behalf of the abolition of slavery and for women's suffrage. But there was certainly a difference in the capabilities and the privileges that you all had versus those women. And so I think it is very important to understand that despite those differences, we saw a need to form coalition to make something meaningful happen in this country. Unfortunately, when we got to the 15th Amendment, and you all were depending on me to be the leader, so to speak, they said it was not time for the woman, that she should stand aside and wait. And there is where some of the cracks in the foundation of our relationships were exploited, so to speak.
Yes, and that helped propel us to what we called the new departure. We were tired of waiting. We were tired of writing letters. We were tired of visiting our congressional representatives and putting letters to the newspaper that would try to explain our cause. And we used the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments to say, well, if we were born or naturalized in the United States, then we are citizens. And then the 15th Amendment saying that the right of a citizen to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race. Well, I have a race. And it was then that we decided, well, we're not going to ask anymore for the right to vote. We are going to assert the fact that we already have it, according to a careful reading of the Constitution. Well, we all know how that turned out. But I did go and vote in 1872, you'll recall.
Well, Ms. Anthony, I think you heard me when I said power concedes nothing without a demand. And so you went out and demanded the right to vote. You got arrested, but nevertheless, you did make your demand.
Did make it known. We did make it known. But when another case was pursued all the way to the Supreme Court said, well, citizenship does not automatically confer with it the right to vote, and that it was up to each individual state to decide. And I said, if we once establish the false principle that US citizenship does not carry with it the right to vote in every state of this union, then there is no end to the petty freaks and cutting devices that will be resorted to exclude one or another class of citizens from the right of suffrage. And we started to see that, didn't we, Mr. Douglass, as the gains during the period immediately after the Civil War started to erode with literacy tests and property taxes and so forth. And the free Negroes did not have access to the ballot box after all.
They tried to take that right back. I think what startled them the most was that the definition of citizenship was finally on the table. Heretofore, they could block it. They would keep us out of the ballot box because they said we were not citizens. Mm-hmm. And because of the fact that this amendment clearly defined the citizen as anyone born on this land, it was something. It was a rock that they really thought, what can we do about this? Because this will mean that we will have to give up the vote to the Black man and the woman born in America.
The utter frustration that we often felt. If history books record our successes and do not record the frustrations and even the sorrows that we were subject to, then the history books are very poorly written indeed. I think it's important for us to remember that the history of the world shows that the vast majority of each generation passively accept the conditions in which they are born, while those who demand larger liberties are ever a small, ostracized minority whose claims are often ridiculed and ignored. It was not just a foregone conclusion that we would reach our goals. And indeed, none of us did. None of us knew what was going to happen in the future. We all had to stand together or stand apart, often in utter loneliness as the world ridiculed us. I can remember walking with you, Mr. Douglass, and being hissed to scorn just for walking with you. I can remember how many newspapers and politicians and ministers decried our work, Susan. We were often lonely, we were often besieged, but we were full of fortitude. We were determined that we were not going to give up, because there is nothing more important than this idea of universal right, that every human being must be included, or not one of us is free.
Thank you for those wonderful words, Mrs. Stanton. I quite agree. And it wasn't just the men whose minds we had to change, although they ultimately are the only ones who can pass an amendment that will ensure that the right to vote is protected. Not given, mind you. I believe we have that vote, but it needs to be protected. But the women themselves, as you said, they are accustomed to the circumstances into which they were born, and they feared that they would be unable to find husbands or unable to enter the kingdom of heaven or any of those rewards that they were told to expect should they encourage our movement. We thought that what we were asking for was no more than our little finger, Mrs. Stanton, and yet the work will be unfinished when we go to whatever awaits us in the next world. But the important thing to remember is that the struggle to secure and protect essential human rights is never ending. We have been busy these many years stirring up the world to recognize the rights of women. We little dreamed when we began this contest that we would be compelled to leave the rest of the battle to another generation of women. But our hearts are filled with joy when we see that they enter upon this task equipped with so much knowledge, with a college education, which was denied to all of us when we were young, and business experience, and the undisputed right to speak in public, all of which were denied to women when we first took up this fight. But I know that with the efforts of that and succeeding generations, that failure is impossible.
Absolutely, absolutely, Susan. And I think I never really realized the character and the strength that you all had until we had that split. Until all of us really, because during Reconstruction or after Reconstruction, when the public just grew totally weary of protecting Reconstruction in the South, that was a blow to me that I had to suffer through. And then you all were suffering through not being able to come through that window of opportunity for the woman's vote. That is when I believe your character really showed. And though we had some differences through that time, you all kept on. Failure was not an option for either of you. And so it's what made me so elated later in my life that we will eventually come back together, and I would come to some of the women's rights conventions, conferences that came to DC, and was able to join hands and celebrate with you all a life well lived.
Well, my friends, I think eternity is calling us back. And all I can say for those of us who lived this life and fought as hard as we did, to our daughters and granddaughters, the work continues. We have bequeathed this movement to you, and we ask that you honor our memories by continuing to honor the idea of freedom.